Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Melissa Winker of Oconomowoc is the Democratic candidate in the 38th Assembly District. Melissa, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Walters.
Why don't you just summarize what you consider to be your top one or two campaign issues before we get to some specific topics?
Sure. So our top campaign priority is really healthcare. That would be our first number one priority. Our second would be working for the people. So number one, healthcare. This is true when I ran in 2018 and is even more vital now in the midst of a global pandemic. The cost of healthcare has increasingly risen while wages have stagnated. So this is a serious concern that could be addressed. Number one, first step, expanding Medicaid expansion. So by making common sense decisions like that at the legislative level could really help a lot of people in Wisconsin.
Well, let's talk about that pandemic. A few questions. The governor's statewide mask edict expires September 28th. It's pretty controversial. Do you think it should be extended from a public safety standpoint?
That would depend on where our numbers are in controlling and mitigating the virus. I know that so far the mask mandate has been a part of logical prevention methods that have been discussed by medical and disease control experts. So I support those mandatory mask orders, and we really can't fully reopen until we stop the virus. We take it seriously. I have confidence that the governor has engaged the best possible advice in his decision-making, and we can't let our guard down.
If the pandemic causes a shortfall in state tax collections this year, I'm making up a number. If we don't collect $1 billion, you're in the legislature, your choices might be raise taxes or fees or cut spending. Where would you come down on that difficult decision?
Sure. How we approach this recovery says everything about who we are as a state. When it comes to fiscal plans, everything needs to be on the table, and everyone needs to come together to sit down at the table and discuss options. The ongoing pandemic has hurt our economies, and it is not over yet. With record job losses, business closings, and increased demands on public services, we are in for a fiscal crisis that requires the very best of us as leaders. On the revenue side, I would start by repealing the tax cuts that were approved by the Republican legislature earlier this year. Tax relief sounds great when you tell families that they'd save a couple $100s a year, but in reality, they gave $23 million in revenue to very few individuals that make more than $330 million a year. And the promise that tax cuts lead to more jobs and better wages is a proven myth. So I would support a budget package that includes tax reform so that everyone pays their fair share. But on the expense side, I would expect that the Evers administration prepares scenarios to reduce spending across multiple departments. My own preference would be to preserve those areas that directly impact families and children, like education, healthcare, and unemployment. I'd also want to protect investments in transportation and basic infrastructure, as these are vital to sustainability. So far, the Republican majority has indicated that they have no intention of convening until January. Lives are on the line, and they must get back to work with an attitude of cooperation. This is our state, and we are in the midst of multiple crises.
We've seen the role that hospitals are playing treated COVID-19 patients. If you're in the Assembly voting on the next state budget, should hospitals be given an even greater priority than they may have in the current budget, Melissa?
Affordable primary health care should be a top priority of our state. We should not forget the problems of personal protective equipment and testing that it was in low supply the beginning stages of our pandemic. My husband is a first responder, and we knew firsthand how stressful it was to be short of these materials. The legislature has many opportunities to support the healthcare system, from appropriating Medicaid reimbursement funds to regulating commercial healthcare, to funding education programs and addressing the shortage of primary care providers. Rural Wisconsin hospitals are particularly important and at risk. Their revenues are hurting due to COVID, both by the burden for caring for patients and by the loss of revenue from non-emergency procedures canceled because patients had to stay away. I will vote for measures that protect our nonprofit clinics at all levels.
Senator Capping had just introduced a bill that says if you're a business or an organization and you've complied with COVID-19 protocols to protect your patients, customers, or employees, you couldn't be sued over COVID. Do we need this law?
I know that everyone should be exempt from frivolous lawsuits. COVID guidelines must be sufficiently enforced before we can expect them to protect public's health. All interests are important here: businesses, employees, and customers. This is an example of where prevention is the best risk management strategy.
The debate over police reforms, there's many proposals. The governor has 9 bills. Speaker Voss is convening a task force. The Black Caucus has a list of changes they like made, and Senator Weingart, a Racine, a retired police officer, has his own bills. What policing reforms do you think are necessary?
I fully support the package of bills that was presented by Governor Evers. Like most Americans, I watched in horror as George Floyd was killed by a police officer holding a knee to his neck for 9 minutes. And then Jacob Blake, who was gravely injured with 7 shots in his back. And now we have vigilantes taking up arms to protect property. I'm grieving for these communities, and I'm calling on our leaders to take action and to help the healing and build trust. When our legislature decides to pass these bills, they will help change the terms of engagement between law enforcement and communities. Policies like restraints on chokeholds and no-knock orders, along with more training and transparency, are necessary, proven, and they're backed by law enforcement and citizen groups. I advocated for these bills when they first came out in June, and I want them to be passed without further delay.
Neighboring states like Illinois have legalized medical and recreational marijuana. What's your position on that?
Legalizing marijuana has been an economic driver in many states. For those in chronic pain or at the end of life, medical marijuana should be an option. Recreational marijuana has also been a proven economic driver, but with careful safety precautions, we should discuss this for our state.
As the debate over who should draw the next congressional and legislative district lines, the Constitution says the party in power in the Capitol, but the governor's got a People's Maps Commission. Do you support the governor's proposal?
Our state constitution requires the legislature and the governor to approve updated voting maps after every census. It does not stipulate who should draw them or what resources the legislature may employ. The legislature controls the process and has every right to engage an independent commission in this critical objective. The most important thing is that voting districts should be created regardless of voting political party. The last time the Republican majority ran this in 2011, they took the process behind locked doors in a private room in a law firm. And over just a few days, with some of the best computer mapping experts available, they manipulated the districts to achieve the outcome that would ensure their party's success. This is gerrymandering. It is as old as the country. Every party charged has used it, but never in history has the rigging been so perfectly crafted to crack up districts and pack one party into different areas. Gerrymandering effectively suppresses the vote. I would like my generation to end it, starting now. We don't need a constitutional amendment to do it with fairness and where partisan data is not allowed into the discussion. Iowa has used this successfully for 40 years with no legal challenges by either party. We deserve fair voting maps, and 72% of Wisconsinites agree.
Property taxes are high in Wisconsin. As a result, schools and local governments have been dealing with caps and limits on their property tax levies for more than 20 years. If you're in the legislature voting on the next state budget, would you vote to continue the caps and limits on property taxes?
Trusting local governments to make decisions is right for our communities. I would lift the tax caps and enable local governments to set the rates that they need to fund their communities. Our school funding formula is particularly unfair and overly complicated. No other state funds our schools, their schools, the way that we do in Wisconsin. The legislature has the ability to increase school aid to fill the gap, but they have instead left schools starved for revenue. We should empower local communities to manage their needs in order to provide vital services like public works, health and safety, and of course, emergency response.
Do local governments like cities, villages, and towns, do they need alternative sources of revenue so they're not so reliant on the property tax? Milwaukee Democrat Evan Goyke has a plan. If you pass a referendum, Milwaukee County could levy a half-cent sales tax. Do local governments need options like that, Melissa?
Yes, I am in support of expanding local options sales tax in several counties as they have adopted. The legislature should not block these local initiatives because the funds raised are invested back into those communities. They often provide property tax relief to residents, and it can be a smart way to support thriving cities and towns.
Last year, Governor Evers wanted to raise the gas tax to stabilize how we pay for highways and bridges. The gas tax is 30.9 cents per gallon, hasn't been raised, I think, in 10 years. Could you vote to raise the gas tax?
Yes, the gas tax has not been raised since 2006, when the annual indexing that has been in place for 2 decades has ended. And it is one of the best returns on investment that we can ensure critical highway maintenance. We all pay dearly for bad roads in terms of vehicle maintenance and accidents. And we all remember the 2007 Highway 35 bridge collapse over the Mississippi River, killing 35. A gas tax is an equitable way to generate investments in key infrastructure so that we can help support and maintain our crucial economy.
When school boards or local governments want to plan major public works projects, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses? There was a study that said in 2015, out-of-state contractors got $72 million. That went to $146 million in 2018. Should local governments have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
Hiring Wisconsin workers is a proven way to protect and restore good job opportunities. Public work contracts are a huge resource that we should use strategically. With the erosion of worker bargaining power and essentially frozen wages over the past decades, local hiring practices are one way that the legislature can reinvest our public funds back into local economies and the pockets of Wisconsin families.
Finally, differences between you and your opponent on November 3?
Thank you. Yes, voters have a very clear choice, and it is about working for the Wisconsin that we want our children to live in. First of all, I would not have stopped working on April 15th during a global pandemic. I would do everything in my power to call on the leadership to get us back into session. The issues of this campaign touch the very lives of our residents. Number one, affordable health insurance is a great challenge for many, even before they might have lost their jobs due to the pandemic. And unlike my opponent, I would fight for Medicaid expansion and bring billions of federal dollars into Wisconsin, save our state money, and give health insurance access to more people. Number two, our economy works for some, but not others. Manufacturing jobs have been lost, and we lead the nation in farm bankruptcies. We've lagged behind the nation in recovering from the 2008 recession. We must tackle the problems of living wages, affordable housing, racial inequality, and unfair public school funding. My opponent has done nothing about these issues in the last 2 years. Number 3, I support gun violence prevention legislation supported by the majority of Wisconsinites to prevent death from accident, domestic homicide, and suicide. We need red flag laws and universal background checks. My opponent is silent on these issues, and the party is unwilling to stand up to vested interests. Number 4, I believe that great public schools are the foundation of our communities. I want to fix the funding formula and freeze the voucher program that bleeds resources away. It is hurting communities. Number 5, I believe we should not wait any longer for justice reforms. My opponent is concerned more about vandalism, not about the loss of human lives, and has done nothing to address the heartbreaking racial disparities that plague our state. And finally, I will work to end gerrymandering and demand fair voting rights. My opponent does not share my concerns. Above all, I will go to work on a broad agenda that is pro-family, pro-community, and pro-worker to create the Wisconsin that we love.
Melissa Winker of Oconomowoc is a Democratic candidate in the 38th Assembly District. Melissa, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too, and thank you.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.